Well, welcome everyone to our fourth session in our 5 Fridays in October for our October Symposium, Preventing Occupational Illness. I truly hope you've been able to join us for the previous sessions where we discussed impact in the face of occupational disease, followed by knowledge change last week. And this week, I'm very excited to bring us tools and action. So what you can do to prevent occupational disease. And next week, please join us for our last and final session, our 5th Friday, where we're leading into November in Lung Month. So Kevin Hedges, who chairs our diesel working group in the Occupational Disease Action Plan you heard about in a previous session, and I put together the session for next week and includes Sean McGinn on preventative maintenance around diesel, a diesel calculator. So we're continuing with tools, and Dr. Christine Oliver, who will talk about lung disease. And this week, I'm very excited to bring you, like you say, grow on what we've discussed around knowledge and change, to have everyone join the action plan with some tools and action to prevent occupational illness. So without further ado, because we do pack these webinars quite solidly, I would like to introduce our first speaker is Dave Zalk. And Dave is the former president of the International Occupational Hygiene Association. He's been serving as the IOHA envoy to the World Health Organization since 2005. Dave received his PhD in control banding from the Delft University of Technology and his MPH from UC Berkeley. Dr. Zalk is an EHS manager of the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, and he's the director of occupational hygiene for the University of Illinois at Chicago's Global Certificate Program in Occupational Health Practice. Dr. Zalk has authored over 50 publications and is continually developing innovative EHS risk management systems for proactive prevention of occupational disease, illness, and injury, and benefiting workers globally. And, you know, I work with Dave. Kevin introduced us to Dave originally, and I'm now joining Dave on the exposure and control banding AIHA committee. And really, I love his term, and I hope what I'm sure he'll also talk about is that we can turn you all into control and exposure bandits. And without further ado, Dave.
But thanks to everyone for being here and for all the organizers. And I really appreciate the opportunity and Kimberly for your efforts. It's really a wonderful panel you have in store for you today. But with my job for control banding, it's action and tools. I think that's a perfect descriptor of what we can offer. And if I can convert you all to control bandits, then I've done my job. I always like to begin with a bit of a history of control banding. But it's risk communication that I think has been the most valuable byproduct of control banding. I'm going to walk you through not just that, but also the management system that's a part of all this. I'm going to go a deep dive into one application, and then I'm going to take a look at both its potential and its future vision. But as I go through this presentation, there are a number of slides. There's probably a publication or presentation behind nearly every slide. So if there's anything that you see that you're interested in, think of this as a buffet. Just shoot me an email when everything's done, and I'll be happy to make sure that you have all the information you need and to assist as you move forward. So let's begin by defining some terms. Occupational exposure banding, and exposure banding is something that a lot of people have heard recently. That is taking a chemical and dividing it into 4 when it comes to its risk. So it's relative risk. If you're looking at an unknown and you need to know whether or not it's really bad or it's not too bad, then occupational exposure banding is the way to determine that. And it's very simple. It can be done with a safety data sheet. Control banding simply takes the same type of qualitative risk assessment process and relative risk ranking, except that as an outcome, it's not just understanding the relative risk, it's also determining a control for the user. So to do this qualitatively, to do it simply, is a real benefit. But this all comes initially from the basis of traditional industrial hygiene or occupational hygiene, which is looking at chemical, physical, biological hazards. And as long as we have something that can tell us what is the hazard and what is the risk and what is a exposure level, we can do a quantitative risk and exposure assessment. And there are a number of approaches associated with that. So in general, especially with chemical hazards, what we're looking at is collecting personal samples. And that's from the worker's breathing zone, which is typically right around the mouth. And what we do is we suck some air, as they say, and we put that onto a filter or into some kind of collection cassette that is intended to get the hazard, the chemical of interest, and then we take that information and we compare that to an exposure limit of what's been developed to be considered a safe level. And that result shows us that the worker is either safe at that level and the controls are appropriate, or it's maybe above that limit and more efforts necessary from the professional. But what do you do if you don't have an occupational exposure limit, which actually is quite likely? There's well over 220,000 chemicals in the world, but there's about 1,000 chemical occupational exposure limits. So you can see there's orders of magnitude difference between the number of chemicals out there and that quantitative information that leads to an exposure assessment. And what about pharmaceuticals? We all live and work with them every day, but for those who actually develop them in research, this is a product that's intended to be toxicologically active at very low doses inside the human body. How do you protect the workers who are developing the product when no rats have died? And also with nanoparticulate, which is another issue that's been around for certainly over 10 years, you also have something that does not have not only no exposure limit, but there's no true toxicological basis that is comparable to other chemicals that we work with. When the brain is a target organ, we're not sure exactly how to begin the process of toxicology. So how do you assess risk to the people who work with and use nanoparticulate? And finally, what if there are no hygiene experts available? There's approximately 20,000 industrial hygienists, occupational hygienists worldwide that are at the professional level. What if they're not available for the workers? So I'm going to take you back into one of my favorite visuals. This is from the Kosh Essentials. And this is really, once you get to understand what you're looking at, an excellent example of what control banding does. This Kosh Essential target, if you will, begins with showing the different relative risks, as with exposure banding. And as you move around the clock, you have hazard group A, which is at the lower level, B, and then up to D at the higher level. And then you also have the aspect of dispersion potential. So this is something, if you're looking at a bulk chemical or a bulk liquid, this is something that can tell you with safety data sheet information and basic information about the process, whether or not you need the following classic controls of general ventilation, engineering control, more total containment, and then special, which typically means calling in your professional. And the dispersion potential is dustiness for the powders, and also volatility for the liquids. So with that simple piece of information, you can figure out where on this chart you end up, and then what is the right control outcome. Now, what you should know when it comes to chemicals, as long as the chemical is required by regulation in a country to have a risk assessment relating to its use, then that country is more than likely going to be open, if not actually including in regulation, control banding tools. Because as the UK found out with Kosh Essentials very quickly, that you can make that requirement for everyone in all workplaces, that the chemical risk assessment is required. But if you don't either have the availability or the money to hire occupational hygienists to fulfill that assessment, then what do? So they came up with the qualitative method of control banding that became the Kosh Essentials, and that is how they built control banding into their regulatory system. Well, the same with the EU, with the REACH system, where they have that requirement. Tier 1 has included control banding tools in their regulation, and at Tier 2, there are numbers that are also acceptable. So as long as there's that requirement and that need, control banding follows with it. Now, with pharmaceuticals, what you're noticing here is that there are 19 different companies, and this is from Dave Ayerts from Purdue Pharma, excellent visual of 19 different companies and their control bands that they use. Well, first off, you should notice there's anywhere from 3 to 6 bands, and you can also see by the colors that they don't line up. And that's one of the issues with this is each company has their own banding process, so there's nothing aligned for all the companies. And also, this is considered an expert base. You need a toxicologist to be able to figure out what chemical compounds they're working with in the research lab and to be able to apply that information into a band. So you really can't do it without having experts. So back to the basics. The traditional model, the quantitative model, is you identify your hazard, you assess your exposure, and then you determine control. And all control banding does is flip these two. You identify your hazard, you identify the appropriate control first, and then as necessary, assess your exposure. So my question to you is, what's the most appropriate paradigm? So if you look at the 2 pictures below with that same question in mind, I think I should just remind you that truly the quantitative sciences are indeed the gold standard. I don't think anyone can really say that that isn't true. However, if you're looking at those workers below and then you bring yourself into their country where you only have $1,000 to protect the workers, how would you spend it? And I should remind you that in a lot of countries around the world, the entire occupational health budget for the nation can be around $1,000. So how would you spend that money? What would you do? It seems like the right time to bring you into the risk communication element of it and how it fits into control banding. So everybody knows that we stop at a red light and we go at a green light. The real question is, what do we do at a yellow light? Well, it really matters who you are and how you interpret that yellow light. Some people stop every time, some people go every time, some people assess traffic, or some people, they check their speed, they peek around the corner and see if anyone's looking, maybe a policeman, and then they decide whether to go. And that checking for police, that aspect of that yellow light, the differential, is how workers really do look at environmental health and safety staff. This is generically speaking, but the last thing I do want for my EHS staff is to be viewed as police in the workplace. So what we did as part of our risk level-based management system is simply divide the risk levels into the yellow, closer to red is risk level 3, closer to green is risk level 2. You'll see this particular risk matrix a number of times for a number of reasons, but I wanted to bring your attention down below to the different risk level controls for the management system. Since it's a management system, the control is how do we manage the information, how much EHS resource do we need? EHS resource increases as the risk level goes higher, and the need for documentation and getting more information increases as it goes higher. So that is the basis of a risk management control banding system known as RLBMS. However, when it comes to risk communication in the worker, once we know the risk level, all the risk communication that the worker needs flows. And I've put this out there to every worker that I've been with. You give me 5 minutes at any worker and I will have them understand everything they need to know about the risk level-based management system. Because once you know the risk level, the workers know what's the relative level of hazard, what controls do they need, the PPE they need, what kind of sign-off or documentation, the training, medical surveillance, all that information flows once the risk level is known. And most importantly for me, managing a team with limited resources, is if they need any advice from an expert, if something changes about the work, it started at a risk level 2 and something changed and they're not certain, I just want them to pick up the phone and call our team to ask that question. So even though we talked at the beginning about chemical hazards, as being bulk chemicals and bulk liquids at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, where the risk level-based management system is something that we use across the laboratory now, and our entire industrial hygiene program is based on it. And if there's a regulation associated with any chemical, then we have divided it into 4 risk levels, and we have a risk level determination document for it. And as you can see with that list below, it really doesn't matter what hazard you present. It can be put into the risk level-based management system. So let's give you an example with nanoparticulate. So going back to our discussion previously about traditional industrial hygiene and what we do, with nanoparticulate, we can sample concentrations in the worker's breathing zone. We have that capability. However, as we also discussed, we're not sure exactly which health effects we're supposed to be looking at. And without that information, you can't have any kind of analytical method specifically identified to assess for those related effects at that level. And therefore, we don't have any occupational exposure levels. Well, that was a problem that existed for a long time. But once it was identified that, well, with unknowns, there's this thing called control banding that really tends to work well. So how do we design this question? And this was Andrew Maynard put this out in 2007, asked the question, how do we apply control banding? Because it seems to work so well for so many other things. So myself and some colleagues over at Lawrence Livermore decided to take on this challenge, and we developed the control banding nanotool. We have the same risk level matrix. We have the same controls. Now the question is, how do we score severity? How do we score probability to be able to get this information and put that all out there for people to use? Well, we dove into all the research available, and we looked at everything related to nanomaterials themselves, from particle shape, surface chemistry, and then the more traditional carcinogenicity, mutagenicity, all of that stuff. We decided to put those down as a score for that. And then the parent material, which is a lot more information available in research, we also did the comparable. If there's an occupational exposure limit, we can put those points in. But the bottom line is we determined that 70% of the severity is tied to the nanomaterial itself and 30% to the parent material. At the probability side, the estimated amount of use, the dustiness, that's a really important one. So that's got the highest number of points, how many employees you're working with. These are the probability factors. And then what you do is you add up your score on the severity and probability side, and then you come up with your risk level. And that tells you your control. And again, these are very standardized controls that are proven effective for nanomaterials, just like any other chemical type exposure potential. But back in 2007, very little was known about nanomaterials, especially in research. As they like to say, not enough rats had died. And with so many unknowns, the question is, how do you score for any of those categories if you don't know the answer? So we decided to give an unknown score of 75% of the highest value for that category. At 75%, if everything is unknown, it's a risk level 3. And if any one category comes up, it becomes a risk level 4. So it was an incentive to obtain the information. So you can do the assessment with unknowns, and if you find information, you can typically lower the score and therefore have a lower risk level outcome. And the whole process was designed to be able to go back and redo your nanotool assessment based on that information. So we were very fortunate that this process became very popular, and when it hit the ISO regulation standard in 2014 and became an ISO standard itself for control banding and nanomaterials, we were very honored that it included the control banding nanotool as its proactive approach. So with that said, it's also been accepted in Canada with the IRSST, and there's the nanomaterial occupational exposure model as well. It's been researched by SafeWork Australia. It's in university programs worldwide. And as it ends up, there are at least a dozen different control banding tools out there for nanomaterials. And so therefore, there's been multiple journal reviews of all these different tools, and they all kind of say control banding tool, it's really good, but without a quantitative validation, we really can't recommend it. So that's what we did. We took our information from 36 laboratory operations, and we already did some qualitative evaluations, and we added to it 22 quantitative evaluations. And we took that information with the quantitative data, we combined it with everything else in the risk level outcome. And what we found out, the control band, the process works really well. When you have 21 of 22 activities fitting the risk level outcome, 12 of those were considered to be consistent with the risk level outcome. 9 of those ended up having the control band was a higher level than the actual airborne measurement, which is really where you want to be. You want to lean to the conservative in a qualitative system. You know, the tier 1, tier 2 errors are really important. You do not want to tell a worker that things are safe when in fact they're not. So this is a very acceptable outcome, and we're very happy with this. But most importantly, we get to combine it with another national laboratory in Berkeley that did their own independent verification, quantitative validation of the control banding nanitool. So by combining that information, we really had all the information necessary to be able to say that we have quantitative validation of a control banding standard. And without an occupational exposure limit, that becomes a gold standard material, a qualitative process becoming a gold standard. Well, in 2009, at an occupational health conference, I got to ask a question to a big group whether or not control banding could be better than traditional occupational hygiene, and I got a lot of laughs and scoffs. But not even 10 years later, at the IOHA conference, we got to tell them that, yes, we have this information, and not only can it be better, it can be a true gold standard. And by the way, at this address, which you'll see again at the end, we have all this information for the control banding nanitool. We make everything freely available and accessible, and we will continue to do so. So everything you need for control banding nanitool is at that site. So let's go back into the broad base of control banding to follow up on the cost essentials. And another thing that they did to address the fact that not everything is a bulk dust or a bulk liquid, they came out with control guidance sheets for a number of different products, and these control guidance sheets are wonderful communication devices. They're 2 pages, they have similar categories, similar design, so no matter which one you look at, you kind of get used to the formatting. They're a fantastic way of giving the information for risk assessment and control. Well, NIOSH took the same kind of mindset and they applied it to ergonomics in construction. So in short, this is a visual for safety control banding using barriers rather than controls on each side. It's also a wonderful description of how all the different occupational health and safety professions fit amongst the spectrum. And that is a discussion that you need to go deeper into, but we have a publication on this, so just let me know, I'll be happy to send it. We also created a control banding approach for environmental, where we determine our probabilities, and our probability outcomes are based on quantity, location, and hazardous characteristics. And once you have your probability level, you then go based on reportability, which is tied to regulations, and that will tell you your severity component. And here we are back with, again, with our very friendly risk matrix that is still the same regardless of which profession is looking at it. And then you have the outcomes once you have the severity and probability, and these outcomes are once again tied to the environmental professions. So this is, again, a different way to use the exact same risk communication, and regardless of which profession you belong to in environmental health and safety, you're using the exact same language of risk level, which is exactly what you want for the workers. Now, once you put that all together, you can then put together information for a trade. So we did that for construction. We created a control banding process for the construction industry. Do not try to read here. We have, again, another publication I can send you on this, but this is the project hazard analysis checklist, where we have severity components for scoring for chemical, physical and for safety, and probability components related to construction projects, where before a project begins, you can get a control banding outcome, a risk level outcome relating to the project. And you can do this as a multidisciplinary application. Now, the outcome here is different because you're designing a product, and really what you're looking for is what training is necessary at that project to make sure that the hazards are controlled. And if you're at an expert level, let's say you have done the PJHA, the pre-job hazard analysis checklist, and you come out at a risk level 4, but you don't have an expert available to cover that project, you only have a competent person. Well, you can go back to the checklist and see if there's ways to design the job and work differently, and it's very easy to do that, especially at the probability level, that you might be able to bring down your risk level to a competent person level. But being able to do that's fantastic. And the other tools that are going to be discussed later today would be fantastic in fitting in to the control level outcomes. So now let's take a jump into our modern world with pandemic diseases. I know it's a comic, and I know some people might or might not find this humorous, but once you get into the Weltanschauung, the worldview of people in our profession, occupational hygiene has, then comedy can come from it. I find this funny. And here we go to the Z94.4. This is from Canada, and you may find this target-looking item, the visual, to be familiar looking. It is very, very similar to the Kosh Essentials original target. And the only thing, and this is fantastic for pandemic diseases, the only thing is, to my understanding, with everything going on with COVID-19, that this hasn't been pushed very much by the Canadian government. And I hope I'm wrong on that, but if it hasn't, that's a real sad thing. I also want to point out, just in research in general, this is a control banding framework that was presented by some of my colleagues, but this is Sietsma et al. And with everything said and done, this was put out in 2019, right before everything COVID-19 hit. And this is a way of looking generically at communicable disease prevention in the workplace. You look at the risk group definition, you define your exposure, you identify your control band, and you select your control banding outcomes. If you look on the right-hand side, Lisa Brousseau brought this out through the BOHS and applied it directly to COVID-19. So that's on the right. But if you look on the left, I wanted to point out that they use some examples in this article that came out in November of 2019, where they looked at coronavirus as one of the theoretical outcomes that can happen. A prison worker with TB and school maintenance with flu. It's very prophetic. I think they did a wonderful job predicting where this might come and how it could be useful. So, and this particular one comes from Mary Cameron from the UK, but my mindset is the control banding potential is fantastic when it comes to what needs to be done related to something like COVID-19. However, we have to agree across the professions on what is the appropriate hierarchy. And once we have an aligned hierarchy of controls, then the control banding flow is not a problem. I'm very happy to see from the US OSHA that they have also taken the risk communication mindset and the same approach to their workplace preparations for COVID-19 with 4 risk levels. Very good, I love it. And each of the job classifications from that. And that is just a fantastic way of communicating risk and prevention of work-related applications for COVID-19. At Lawrence Livermore, where I work, of course, they actually expected us. We had this problem, go solve it. Come up with a control banding risk matrix, the 4 levels of risk and how we would implement it and the controls that flow from it for COVID-19 and respirators. But with all that said and done, this comes from 2018 from the AIHA Synergist. This is still true today. The role of the hygienist in preventing transmission of communicable diseases, we are still underrepresented. There are so many response planning professionals that still do not fully understand what we as a profession can do. And that's part of why I'm here, is to help communicate it to those who may not have that full awareness of our role and what we can do, but most importantly, how we can do this all together. And especially any type of work-related communicable disease, if you have a risk level-based management system, you have all the information that can flow from it with risk communication, which is essential, as we discussed, just that missing piece involving the hygienist. And we can come out with a singular environmental health and safety language that can be consistent, not just at a national level, but it can be consistent in every workplace. However, I keep getting told that you can't use a qualitative risk assessment project when it comes to regulations. Well, at Lawrence Livermore, we have a contractual obligation to over 1,200 different regulations, which include the ACGI CLVs as being treated as regulation. So we decided to go head first into this, and we created our similar exposure groups. We took our risk level based management system qualitative outcomes that we had for the risk level. We then went and quantitatively validated 15 different SEGs. And what we found out is the same type of positive information that we had with the nanomaterials. We had the same positive information coming back for the SEGs, and we have everything that we need to make sure that that's moving forward. And when it comes to a risk management system that goes qualitative to quantitative, that is also a gold standard. So we can say here at this show, because this is brand new and this item has just gone out when it comes to publication, I'll be happy to send it to you. But once again, we have everything that we need to do that. So now let's go back to the global perspective. And this is something that I put up over 10 years ago just to explain control banning on a global setting, where the size of the country is really a good determiner of what type of control processes and health and safety processes is necessary. You have the very rich countries that are well staffed with the HS professionals, all the way down to people that may have very little or no staff. And really, when it comes to a gold standard on the global perspective, those who have the gold, they set the standards. But around the world, 2.8 billion workers, and at best 10 to 15% have some aspect of some very basic level of occupational health service, leaves 2.5 billion workers who will never meet anyone like us. So how are these workers protected? I guess the answer is they're not, because we have about 2.8 million deaths per year related to occupational disease and injury. And if you take the more major ones that are out there and put out there, this is something that we really have to make sure that we understand. You can add those other three together, it still doesn't add up to where we are with occupational injury and disease. So we do want to make sure that something is done to address this very, very necessary issue. Now, if you take a look at this particular graph, that circle covers areas of the world where we don't really have the hygiene profession. And that's why I spend my time doing this. It's my free time that I do it, because somebody needs to take action to prevent 2.8 million work-related deaths. So let's go into a very quick visual. What hazards do you see in this? What do the workers need in their toolbox today? And that's all they really care about. Is it risky? Well, if we use the risk level-based management system to communicate this, we can show the risk level for each of the EHS professions and be able to communicate to them what to put in their toolbox. But what do we do in another part of the world? Well, construction takes over 20% of industry, and so it's comparable and similarly performed around the world, so we can use the same information there. But a lot of places don't speak English, so let's jump that hurdle by using pictograms to describe which environmental health and safety organization or profession we're looking at, and let's take it one step better. Let's go ahead and use a color code to be able to do that as well for the risk levels. And what if we were to create an app for a smartphone, and we could just click a button and a worker can see everything that they need on that given day to protect themselves? Well, now that we're at nearly the same number of smartphones in the world as we have workers. It's capable, and we have the ability to be augmenting reality. And if we can apply that also in the workplace, where nearly every workplace can have at least one person with a smartphone, there's absolutely nothing holding us back. So maybe control banding is a gold standard for reducing work-related risk and saving millions of lives every year. And that's some of the work we do with the Workplace Health Without Borders. We have projects going on to help build the hygiene abilities and capabilities in places where it's most needed around the world. And we're looking for collaborative opportunities to implement the risk level-based management system and control banding methods so we can take action, because control banding is the tool to help prevent occupational disease. I thank you very much for your time and effort, and I really appreciate you staying with me at this, for me, very early hour. The sun's just come up in California. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. I so appreciate, and it's very purposefully to have you lead out today's session as we talk about some of the other tools and what their limitations might be, and the the expansive opportunities that you laid out, and really making accessible where we don't have hygienists and we can't do classical exposure assessments, and where we don't have occupational exposure limits in the nanotechnology world. So Jennifer, I'm not sure if, and we can invite people, we have a couple of minutes for questions now for Dave. Should anyone like to raise a hand or throw the question in the chat window is really the best way with so many participants.
We don't have any questions at this time in the chat.
Well, typically when I don't hear questions, it means everybody's sold. So we're looking at a number of brand new control bandits. And the reason I say it must be sold is because anytime you try to sell qualitative to a quantitative world, you have a lot of head shaking. And sometimes people get quite angry, as a matter of fact. But what we've noticed lately is we have enough foundation of proof and the ability to show how a qualitative process can be successful. And I'm just happy. No questions makes me happy, but I love to hear challenges. That's how we get better. Yes, Kevin.
Kevin here. I've got a question, Dave. Fabulous presentation, by the way. Thank you so much. Control banding has been around for many years. It started off from the pharmaceutical industry, and then health and safety executive picked it up with COSH Essentials. Might have been 2 decades ago, I think, maybe earlier. Why do you think there's such a delay in other countries, such as the UK, adopting the same kind of approach as, say, COSH Essentials?
Oh, that's an excellent question, and it's not like I have the gold standard answer for that either. But very interesting is I was very fortunate to be invited to Australia to speak on control banding, and they shocked me with the topic. They said, "Can you talk about the birth, death, and rebirth of control banding?" And this was right around it was about just under 10 years ago, and I was thinking it never died. I've been working with this since the late 90s, and basically, that's really the way to think of it. What happened is control banding's been around actually since the 70s and 80s, as far as the mindset of dividing risk qualitatively. And when it came into the pharmaceutical industries, you are talking, in the 90s is the chunk of that. COSH Essentials took that information and used biosafety and radiation levels as a mindset and a comparability in the late 90s to build the foundation for it. But then what ended up happening is as soon as it became, things like that became available on the internet and worldwide and everybody started to notice it, there's a big push that by the quantitative sciences, the professionals saying this is not a good idea, it's not quantitative, therefore we shouldn't pay attention to it. And that was around 2005. With the rebirth through nanomaterials, the proof that it can work in the absence of information, that's really what brought it back to life. And what we need to do is get that type of information more out there. This quantitative validation that control banding can be a gold standard, this is brand new information. Our nanomaterial information came out in 2018. We just put out our risk level based management SEG validation. That was just a month ago. So it's just getting out there. We just need people to communicate it. And once we show that qualitative can be as good as quantitative and even better, there really should be nothing holding us back from making sure we can address the multiple orders of magnitude differential between EHS professionals that are available and then the workers who actually need to have this done. It needs to be involved in regulation.
Thanks, Dave. I just wanted to support the commentary and say that I've mentioned this in various presentations before, but I think not to call out, but I'll say health and safety professionals, scientists, hygienists sometimes get in our own way, and we can't possibly serve all the workers all over the world through quantitative measures. We can't possibly do that, and it would be unethical to say that we can. And I think that some people refuse to say that in science because they are putting themselves out of work, and that's so inappropriate. So I just, thank you again. If there are no other questions, Jennifer or Vani, we may move on to our next presentation. So thank you, Dave. Yep, I see another tool in our toolbox, and very much appreciate it. And you may be interested in this Melanie's presentation later on the silica control tool that they've worked on out in BC, in your neck of the woods, a little north.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, that's a good one. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Dave. So we're going to move on to our second set of speakers today. And if Danielle would like to go ahead and put up our slides while I introduce you both. It was purposeful that we had Dave speak first because, and let's just move right, Danielle and Marnie, Danielle Drolet is going to, and Marnie TV are going to speak on our OEL, our OCAL OEL tool. So this is another tool in your toolbox, and a much more limited one. So I would like to introduce Marnie TV, who is the Senior Policy Advisor with the Ministry of Labor, Training and Skills Development, and works very hard on the hazardous substances regulation. And also Danielle Drolet, who we've worked with in the hygiene world, and those who have seen Danielle's tools and worked with them in the past will be very familiar with his work. He was integral in developing many of the Quebec tool that is the foundation of this one. He's worked for 33 years at the Quebec, or did work at the Quebec Research Institute in Occupational Health and Safety, or the IRSST, in Montreal. He's developed with many collaborators numerous applications for both laboratory and industrial hygiene uses for benefit of the industrial hygiene community, including MIXI, Saturisk, Heat Stress Tools, Protect Pro. He's an active member of the IHA Exposure Assessment Strategies Committee, and he's been involved in their cool new tools development and did some training with our own hygienists at OCAL on ISTAT and iMod, and IH Skin Perm and others. So first we're going to hear from, I'll just introduce some of the background. We're going to talk this morning, we did this project with, as part of the Occupational Disease Action Plan. I'll give a little bit of background, and then Marnie's going to give the Ontario context. And then Danielle is going to talk about the Quebec Model Foundation and provide some history on some other models. And then you guys are going to get to demo the tool. So your action is going to occur while you're involved here today. So really the limitations, you just saw them. We have 220,000 chemicals. And only, OELs for 700 odd occupational exposure limits. And we know that we want to do better than compliance, and we know that we want to look at all sorts of ways of reducing exposure to contaminants. And we don't even know the hazards of some of the chemicals that we're making so quickly. So, and there are a number of models, and you're going to hear about that from Danielle and Marnie. Really, the intent is to help us look at exposure limits from a regulatory standpoint that we have right now for irregular work shifts. So when you're working longer hours, the TLVs, the occupational exposure limits are based on an 8-hour, 40-hour work week, and that's just not what people work anymore. So again, this spawned out of the Occupational Disease Action Plan, and Marnie and her group were integral, as well as Martin Albinger, Kevin Hedges, and John Odick. And we're working on a second phase to the tool that we could talk about later. This one is a compliance-based tool, and you'll see that we want to, again, make hygiene and that world accessible to others to help us reduce exposures. So Marnie, why don't you take it from here and give us the Ontario context?
What I thought at this time is sort of just speak to a little bit of sort of the use of the tool itself, but sort of how it came about and sort of in terms of the process. So basically, the use of the OEL adjustment method based on the Quebec model was introduced as a broader package of amendments to Reg 833, the control of biological or chemical agents, and OREG 49009, the designated substances. So there's a broader package of amendments that came into effect on January 1st of this year, and also on July 1st of this year. Some of these changes I just wanted to go over because it's important, perhaps for those that don't know, to sort of be aware of what some of these changes are. We introduced a new medical surveillance code for the designated substances. And for those that are in the know, then I guess there's 11 designated substances, and the medical surveillance code applies to 7 of them. And you can see the stuff on the ministry's website. We also introduced new respirator and air measuring provisions in Reg 49009, the designated substance reg, as well as Reg 833. And they're sort of based on, this is the first time in legislation, certainly Reg 833, which applies to the majority of substances, about 750 exposure limits set out in legislation, but pretty much to all substances. This is the first time in legislation that we actually have specified respirator provisions as well as air sampling or air monitoring provisions. So it's important, just want to make sure everybody's aware of that. We included substitution in the hierarchy of control. It was encouraged, and certainly everybody knew about it. It was never specifically mentioned in legislation. And we adopted in July new and updated OELs or listings for 36 substances in Reg 833, which is the primary reg for setting out the occupational exposure limits. You can find those on the ministry's OEL webpage. We have a sort of a consolidated list of the OELs applicable to Ontario workplaces. And last but not least, which I will go over, is providing for the use of the Quebec model based on the work of the, University of Montreal and the IRST. And this provides adjusting of OELs for irregular work shifts. For those that want to know a little bit more about that, we actually consulted on that in March, between March and May of 2018. So everything we do, we have to go out for a public consultation. The other proposals that I mentioned before are now that have been adopted into legislation. They were the subject of some of them were subject of the same consultation, but they might have been the subject of earlier consultations. So if anybody has any questions on that, they can ask Kimberly, and I can sort of get them the information on any of that stuff. As Kimberly had mentioned, OELs are typically based on the 8-hour workday and the 40-hour work week. Now in Ontario, like I guess most jurisdictions, irregular work shifts are commonplace in a range of industries, and examples, of course, mining is probably one of the sort of the main ones. And then we have, of course, healthcare, we have, and manufacturing. Prior to January 1st, which is when the Quebec model was adopted into our legislation, Ontario's approach set out in legislation, and you would find it in the schedules, Schedule 1 of both Reg 833 and 49009, which applies to the designated substance, was to reduce the TWA proportionally based on the increased exposure time. The advantage of this, of course, is simple to use. And the disadvantage is, I guess it's a one-size-fits-all. All substances, regardless of toxicity, are treated the same, which can be, in some cases, lead to be more protective, and so forth. Based on stakeholder interest and also recognizing there's other models out there, and the fact that Quebec is a neighboring province of ours, MLL, the ministry, put out a proposal to adopt the Quebec model in legislation, or provide for the use of the Quebec model in legislation. Not to get into the specifics of this, but the Quebec model takes into consideration an agent's effect on the body and considers like toxicological information such as sensitization, irritation, and so forth, in addition to exposure and recovery time. So once again, it's more agent specific. The model, in terms of, I guess, looking at it from the policy side, not only is it something used in our neighboring province and recognized there, and certainly the work of the RST is recognized, the fact that it's referenced in the ACGH handbook and Ontario's OEL update process, and a lot of work we do, and certainly in the industrial hygiene community, does look to the work of the American Conference of Governmental Industrial Hygienists. So this sort of lends sort of credibility to any efforts Ontario was going to make to look to recognizing this model. Also, in terms of looking at other jurisdictions at home, and there's we're sort of looking at trying to harmonize as much as we can across Canada. There's a broader initiative. It's very difficult because of the different governments in play, and health and safety is a provincial matter. But where we can, there's been an effort to harmonize, and sort of, so we looked at the fact that the model is used in other Canadian jurisdictions such as BC and Alberta, and it's recognized internationally. So that's how we came about. For those that are not familiar with the legislation, what I put up here is Schedule 1. Schedule 1 is the airborne measurement and calculation of exposure provisions that are set out in Reg 833, the main reg, control of exposure of biological chemical agents. And then also the same provision is found, schedule is found in 49009, the designated substance reg. Just to back up a little bit about a lot of the work that's going on, we're trying to basically align we had more specific provisions in the designated substance regulation than we had in Reg 833, which controls lots of hazardous substances that are even more or is equally as hazardous in the designated substance regulation. So there's some of the changes provide for greater alignment. And one of the things is, even the schedules, when we're looking at doing updating, we're aligning the schedules, and hopefully at one point we'll be able to sort of collapse and create like a single OCHealth reg and sort of build on that. So that's part of some of the work that's going on. So the schedules are the same. What I put here is just highlighted in yellow the change. So section para 5 in Schedule 1 has remained unchanged, except it now says subject to subsection 6, which then provides for the use of the Quebec model, which is where I put in new there. And basically it provides for the use of the methodology set out in the guide for the adjustment of permissible exposure values for unusual work shifts, which is the Quebec model. And it's very important to note the last line, using the applicable TWA set out in the Ontario table or the ACGH table. Now, for those familiar with Reg 833, Ontario we have the Ontario table or table 1, and the OELs that are more or less, we call them made in Ontario, the ones that are different than ACGH are listed in the Ontario table. And then the legislation works, if the OEL for the substance is found in that table, that is the OEL that's applicable. And if not, you look to the ACGH handbook for the year that's cited in legislation. And that's why it says the applicable TWA set out in the Ontario table or the ACGH table. As I mentioned earlier, we do have an online table that will list all OELs applicable to Ontario workplaces, and that's found on the OEL landing page on our website. So I'm just hoping gives you a bit of a snapshot of, sort of the basis of the proposal and then where to find the actual change in legislation.
Thanks, Marnie. That's great. Daniel, over to you.
So let's talk about the Quebec model. What is the Quebec model and what is the history? Actually, the adjustment for OELs for extended work shift started in 2001 in the regulation. But before that, there were a lot of study, particularly at University of Montreal, and there was at the Worker Compensation Board, the CSST, a committee about the OEL, and they finally adopt a procedure to adjust the OEL according to the proposition coming from the research group from the University of Montreal and IRSST. I was part of this work, and in 2000 there was the first version of the adjustment guide, and we provide in 2001 the first version of the adjustment tool. There is a very important document called the adjustment guide, and with each change of OEL's values, they have to be updated. So what is important to understand in the Quebec model is the guiding toxicological principle. And this principle is to guarantee an equivalent degree of protection for workers with conventional schedule of 5 hours per day, 5 days per week, and for workers with unusual schedule. So an equivalent degree of protection, no more, no less. So, and finally, we decided to adopt what we call the OSHA logic, and the key is to attribute primary health effects to each substance in our regulation, and then depending on the timing of the effects after exposure, we attribute a category of adjustment. And we may have 4 different categories, 1, 2, 3, or 4. And category 1 is no adjustment at all for the reasons you see in this table. And 2, 3, or 4, there is an adjustment according to either the daily adjustment, weekly adjustment, or for substances that produce effects following short or long-term short or long-term exposure. We have to calculate both the procedure of adjustments and keep the most severe result. So there are application conditions. Obviously, adjusted OEL cannot be higher than the original OEL itself. Only the TWA OEL are subjected to adjustment. There's no adjustment for stale value or ceiling values, and it is normally reserved for planified working schedule, not exceptional working schedule. And in the guide here, you have many definitions and the explanations. So, and you can download this guide, and this is the latest version published in 2015. There is another one in preparation because the values in Quebec have been changed recently. So let's talk about the OEL adjustment itself. It is very simple. It is a Microsoft Excel file. Actually, it is a workbook containing many worksheets. And the structure of this file is that when you enter in the file, you are driven to the disclaimer page and then to an introduction page, and then you can go in the calculation tool itself. Obviously, this file can be downloaded from the OCAL website at this very particular address here. So, the file to download is the version 1.1. So it is important to say that the tool, this file works only if when you open the file, you enable the content because there are macros in this file. So you have to enable the content or set what we call the macro security level to enable. And there is some explanation in the file itself how to change this parameter. So the main page of the tool is this one. It is very simple. So this is a screen capture, and it's a 1, 2, 3 step process. So number one, you have to select from this drop down here one of the substance, and there are more than 700 substances. So this is step number one. Step number two, you have to enter the daily schedule and or the week schedule, depending on the adjustment category of the substance. When you enter the substance, you have the original OEL, and when you enter the daily and the week schedule, we can calculate an adjustment factor, and the result, the three-step process, is the adjust TWA. So it is as simple as that. Obviously, in the tool itself, we have in a table form a copy of the OELs coming from the Ontario regulation. So in this table, we have 769 TWA values, and we have a distribution of the adjustment codes as follows. So 266 substances has no adjustment, and the rest is adjusted either from 2, 3, or 4, and we will take some examples. So I'll try to start a live demo. Let me present just one example before. Let's say we have acetonitrile as example. The OEL is 20 ppm, and the category of adjustment is 2. And let's say we have a work shift of 10 hours. It means that we have to multiply 20 by 8 divided by 10. It means that we have a result for the adjust OEL as 16 ppm. So it is as simple as that. Let me try to open the tool itself. This is the introduction sheet. To access to the tool, you have to click on Start. If you want to know more about the model Quebec, you can click on this blue arrow, and you have this page, and you may consult the Quebec regulation, the latest version of the Quebec Adjustment Guide, understanding the guiding principle, and have access to scientific paper, the main scientific paper. If you want to come back to the intro sheet, just click to the home button and then go on Start. So let's say this is what I call the eraser. Let's say I have an exposure of toluene. So I have to select a substance that is toluene coming from, so toluene. So you see the adjustment category is 4. So I have two green cells. So I have to enter the daily schedule and the week schedule. And when I enter these two values, I have the OEL, the adjustment factor, and the result of the adjusted TWA. I can delete that, and I can run pre-formatted example. So let's say I select benzoyl chloride. There is no TWA, so no adjustment. Same thing for furfural, same thing for ethylene. We have one, but the adjustment category is 1C. Another example, gasoline. So adjustment category 2. So 2 means I need only the daily schedule. So only this cell is green and has to be filled. So I can calculate the adjust TWA. Another example, lead. Adjustment category is 3. Let's enter the week schedule in that case, and we calculate the adjust category. And the last example, styrene with an adjustment category. We have to enter both daily and week schedule, and we can then calculate both adjust TWA and keep the most severe. In that case, it is 23.3. So the file is as simple as that. So I'll let Kimberly finish the presentation.
Thank you so much, Danielle and Marnie. So that was a whirlwind tour of the OEL tool, Vonnie, and the guide. Vonnie has placed the tool link and the IRSST guide as background documentation for in the chat window. And it is we're going to move on to the silica tool presentation now. And I really hopefully everyone can share the tool and use your action to reduce exposures by adjusting your time weighted average for your work shift. It's a nice flexible easy to use Excel file, and we are looking at a phase 2 tool in the future that looks at health-based exposure limits, and it may even we be looking at an app version. So stay tuned for all of that. So as we move on, we have Melanie Gorman-Ing joining us to talk about building on more tools based on Dave's first leading us out today on exposure and control banding. And Melanie's going to talk about the silica control tool, which we introduced at the October symposium last year. And she's going to give us updates on this tool being utilized by the BC government and the BC Construction Safety Association. So Melanie Gorman-Ing is a senior research scientist at the BC Construction Safety Alliance. She carried out occupational hygiene research with a particular focus on developing statistical models for estimating exposures to hazardous materials in the workplace. She developed the database and the model that drives the silica control tool with Dr. Hugh Davies of the UB School of Population and Public Health. Her previous work includes estimating occupational exposure levels for a US study that investigated the health effects of the Gulf of Mexico oil spill, and a EU study of the health and economic burden of occupational carcinogens in the EU. So we are very happy to have Melanie join us, and we should have caught ourselves up in time to have questions for Melanie when she is finished. So welcome, Melanie.
Hi, thank you, Kimberly. Yeah, I'm just going to run through the silica control tool. I'm not sure if any of you attended the October symposium last year. I did a kind of brief kind of run through of the silica control tool there. So some of this will be a little bit of review of that, but I'm going to go into it in a bit more detail and talk about some of the updates that we have done since last year. I call it like a living risk assessment tool because it's something that we're always working on. It's a kind of I think of it as kind of a mechanism for us to kind of be continually monitoring and improving silica control in the construction industry. So I work for the BC Construction Safety Alliance, which is an organization that provides health and safety services for the construction industry in BC. We're funded by the construction industry workers' compensation premium. So and we have a a board of advisors of construction industry people. So we're by and for the construction industry. And this is a tool that we developed for our local industry, but it's something that I think has a lot of potential for other jurisdictions as well. So so without further ado, I'm just going to get into background about silica in general. Now, I think most of you are probably familiar with silica. It's a naturally occurring mineral that is present in sand and gravel and a lot of the construction materials that we use. And when those materials are disturbed through cutting, grinding, blasting, all these kind of construction activities, it can create a fine respirable dust that can cause lung cancer. So CAREX Canada has estimated that there are about 380,000 workers exposed in Canada to hazardous levels of respirable crystalline silica, and over half of those are in the construction industry, 56%. And it causes about 573 cases of lung cancer per year. It also can cause silicosis, which is a fibrotic lung disease. And it's kind of hard to get at exactly how many people have silicosis because that's related to construction work, because the record keeping is not great. So, but from putting together hospitalization data, medical services data, and workers' compensation data, it looks like there's about 363. There were 363 cases in this time period, 1992 to 2007, and very, very few of them were recorded in the workers' compensation data. So there may be more than we would think just from looking at workers' compensation data. So the reason why the silica control tool was originally developed was that in BC, our local regulator is WorkSafe BC, and they were planning to implement some new regulations around respirable crystalline silica. And these regulations came into effect in 2017, but we knew about them, that they were going to be coming back in 2013. And basically, these are substance-specific requirements for any work site where respirable crystalline silica exposure might be present. We have a very low occupational exposure limit in BC. We have to have adopted the ACGIH-TLV of 0.025 milligrams per cubic meter. I think in Ontario, you guys have 0.1 milligram per cubic meter as your exposure limit. Other jurisdictions have 0.05, but there are a few other Canadian jurisdictions that have 0.025, like, for example, Alberta. So in these new regulations that were going to be coming into place, there's a requirement to monitor exposure for any work activity that generates RCS dust and create a written exposure control plan. So as I said, these regulations were implemented in 2017, but we were preparing for them in advance. And we wanted to create something that would make this easy for construction contractors to comply with, because it was going to be a real challenge for the construction industry to generate these plans, to do these measurements, because the majority of them are very small businesses with less than 5 employees. And so, yeah, there are many challenges when it comes to occupational hygiene work in the construction industry. The work sites are rapidly changing just by the nature of the work. People are moving around in between different work sites. There are different companies all working together, different like subcontractors all working for the same prime contractor coming and going. The task that an individual worker would do can vary within and between work shifts. So if you take, a full shift measurement of a worker, their exposure the very next day could be totally different, because they could be at a different work site doing a different activity entirely. And there's a lack of available in-house exposure measurements and industrial hygiene expertise in the industry. And this is largely because it's mostly made up of small businesses. 92% of BC construction employers have less than 10 employees, and 85% have less than 5. And my understanding is that this is common worldwide, that this is just what the construction industry is like. So recognizing that it was going to be difficult for companies to go out and collect all their own measurement data, WorkSafe BC, they put a clause in the new regulation saying that you don't necessarily need to do your own hygiene measurements. You don't always need to have a consultant or employ a hygienist. You can use monitoring data that's based on objective air monitoring data that was collected during equivalent work operations through industry surveys or peer-reviewed or scientific studies. So if you can find data that relates to the same task, like if you're going to be drilling concrete and you have some other data about drilling concrete, you can just use that in your risk assessment, which is really great and makes things a lot easier. However, even that was going to be a challenge for the construction industry, because how would they find this data? How would they evaluate it? How are they going to, how will they know if it's appropriate? What if the data is in a peer-reviewed study that's behind a paywall? So we thought we would try and come up with something to help people to access this data, because there was data out there on silica exposure, but we wanted to put something together to connect the industry with the data in a way that would be easy for them to use. So the BCCSA partnered with the University of British Columbia, the School of Population and Public Health. There's a hygiene department there, and WorkSafe BC and we created a steering committee to come up with a solution to this problem for the industry. And this was back in, I became involved in 2014. And we released our final product in 2017 to coincide with the new regulation coming into place, and that ended up being the silica control tool. So it's a web-based tool. It's online, and the idea is that it's to help employers to use existing data, and also it has a lot of educational components inside it to give information about occupational hygiene, about exposure control, risk assessment, and silica, the hazards. So all that information is in the website as well, and it helps people. It allows people to produce effective exposure control plans. So if someone goes through and uses the silica control tool, at the end, they will come up with a written exposure control plan that documents exactly what they would need to do, what their expected exposure level would be, and it's designed to be compliant with our local regulations. So it's intended to reduce the effort and the cost associated with generating these exposure control plans, and also to help people to create better exposure control plans, to improve the quality of exposure data that they're using in their risk assessment, because all of the data that we use to generate our estimates in the silica control tool is all curated by us at the BCCSA, and we work with a team of experts to do that. So the way that it basically works is we have a database of over 4,000 personal respirable crystalline silica measurements that have been collected from the peer-reviewed literature, from government databases. We've got in touch with the industry to find out who had data that they had filed away, and we put that into our database. We've done our own sampling. So we have this large database of silica exposure measurements, and we used a linear regression model to create a predictive equation, so that if you enter details about the activity that you're planning to do, it can predict the exposure level both with and without engineering controls. So, for example, you would maybe enter that you're going to be drilling concrete outdoors on a new build residential construction site, and you're going to be using local exhaust ventilation that is integrated to the tool. And with all those parameters, the tool can estimate the exposure level based on our database. And the tool then, it compares that exposure, the estimated exposure level, to the exposure limit. And if required, it would tell you what kind of respirator you would need. And it creates an electronic and a paper exposure control plan. And for most of the activities that are available within the silica control tool, we have multiple engineering control options. So you may choose a wetting control, you may choose a local exhaust control, you could have a closed cab. So there are options, and users, when they go through and use it, they can compare different options and see which ones are more effective. And so people can, this is again part of the kind of educational aspect of it. I have a few screenshots. I'm not going to go and do, sometimes I do a full, like I run through the entire tool and do a demonstration. I don't think I have time to do that today. So I'm just going to do an abridged version of basically what it looks like when you're going through it. So this is a screenshot of one of those pages in the tool. This is the one where you select the work activity that you're doing. So you would select the material, in this case concrete, the task, drilling, and the tool that you're using. For example, an electric hammer drill. And we have links in the tool. So if somebody is going through and using this and it doesn't have the activity that they're doing, then you can click on this link, can't find your material, task, or tool, click here. They would click on that link, and then they would get in, that would put them in touch with us, so that we would then find out that they've been trying to use it for this application that's not available. And so when we receive these requests, then that kind of tells us, oh, this is something that people need, we should try and get this into the tool. And then that would prompt us to go out and do sampling to try and get more data so that we could put it into the tool. So once they've selected their activity, then it gives an initial exposure analysis, an initial exposure estimate with no engineering controls. So in this case, it's 0.066 milligrams per cubic meter, which would be above our exposure limit. And it tells the user that they would need to do something to further control this exposure. Then it goes through a whole series of pages, which I won't go through. I'm not going to go through all of them today, but basically it guides people through the hierarchy of controls and asks them to consider, can you eliminate this activity? Can you substitute the material with something else? For example, if you're doing sandblasting, can you use a lower silica product? What kind of administrative controls are you using? And engineering controls, and finally, at the very end, it goes into PPE. But because the model really can only model the effect of engineering controls, I'm going to go straight to the engineering controls. So in this case, we have a few different options for the user for this activity. They could choose a wetting method that's integrated to a tool, local exhaust ventilation. You can select an engineering control that is not listed, and this is again one of these mechanisms for us to learn more about what needs to be in the tool. So if somebody selects engineering control not listed, it would not be able to complete an estimate for the user with that engineering control, but it would put them in touch with us so that we find out that there's this engineering control that we don't know about that needs to get added into the tool. Or they can go ahead and create an exposure control plan with no engineering control and just respiratory protection if that is appropriate for their scenario. So finally, with the engineering control that we selected, which was a local exhaust integrated to the drill, this lowers the exposure to 0.032 milligrams per cubic meter, which in many places would be an acceptable level, but in BC it's still above our exposure limit, so they would need to then go on and to select a respiratory protection, and the tool would tell them that you need something with a protection factor of 10, and it would give some examples of what that might look like, what kind of respirators would be appropriate. But I'm not going to show that slide because I'm going to go straight into some more discussion. So as I've kind of alluded to earlier, we provide support at BCCSA. We have a team that works on this. If people phone us with questions, if they go through these interfaces in the tool, that puts them in touch with our team at the BCCSA. And we can do things like if somebody phones up and they have no idea where to start, we can guide them through it. Or if somebody gets in touch and they have an activity that's not in the tool, that puts them in touch with us, and then we can maybe arrange directly with that user to go out and do sampling at their work site, and that gives us the data that we need, and it gives them the information that they need. So we're doing continual data collection to make the tool better and to support the industry, and we're updating the tool in response to user requests and new data that becomes available. So yes, we are doing this ongoing silica sampling that we started sampling in 2015 to kind of update the database that we had available for the silica control tool. The tool launched in 2017, and we've just kept on sampling ever since then. We work with local hygiene consultants. They sometimes give us a heads up if some of their clients are doing silica sampling that might be of interest to the tool, and then we can get in touch and see if we can access that data or provide some of the funding for the sampling that they're doing in order to access the data. So that has been a good partnership that's worked for us. This summer, we partnered with one of the consultants to hire an occupational hygiene summer student to go and do a big sampling campaign to get data that can go into the tool. That student also did a literature review for us to kind of update the literature that we have available in the tool, because that hadn't been updated since the tool launched in 2017. So this allows us to add new activities to the silica control tool, new construction activities. It allows us to add new controls, for example, dustbane or sweeping compounds. So in the new update that we're about to launch of the silica control tool, we're adding a control that wasn't in it before, which I call here dustbane, but I think that's a proprietary term for these kind of sweeping compounds that you could suppress dust. And yeah, we're just always filling in gaps. For some activities, there are controls that are possible and that we know they're possible, but we can't add them yet because we don't have the data. So we're always looking for opportunities to collect that data so that we can add that into the tool. So this is an image from a recent paper that we published on this silica control tool approach. It was by me and Hugh Davies, who we kind of led the scientific development of the silica control tool. So, and it shows just the general idea of how we think this can help to expand our knowledge and our understanding and improvement of silica control in BC and everywhere, really. So we started with published exposure data. We supplemented that with data that we collected from consultants, industry, government, anybody who was willing to share a database with us. This is where we started in 2015. We used that to do regression modeling, to develop a predictive equation, which goes into the tool. Then the users identify a gap, which prompts us to collect new data, which then goes into the database, and then that goes through the whole cycle. So it's a cycle that is kind of self-perpetuating, and I think that we're improving it all the time. Now, I just want to go through some of the benefits that we've found from using measurements. So one of the options that we had, we didn't necessarily have to make this predictive model and database. We could have used the database to just create kind of a lookup table or something like, if you're drilling, here's a control that you should use, and that would have been a simple approach. Well, not simple, it would have been difficult to develop the database, but that is an approach, and that's kind of similar to what they've done in the United States with OSHA. They have table 1 that tells people exactly what they need to do for common construction activities, and that's a valid approach. And I think that the recommendations that they came up with in table 1 are pretty similar to what we would kind of see in the silica control tool. But the reason why we chose to do this approach is because with this, well, one of the reasons is you can calibrate it to other jurisdictions. So our database is not just BC data, it includes American data from other provinces, data from Europe. So this tool could be used elsewhere. And it also, just going through and using the tool, it helps the user to see evidence of the exposure control effectiveness and kind of get an understanding of what they're dealing with. It's a way for measurements that are being taken to be used more than once. So it prompts people to do measurements so that we're always up to date on what's going on. And then once those measurements are taken, they don't just get stored away in somebody's computer. They go into our database and they can be used in perpetuity. Also, since we're continually doing this monitoring, we can monitor trends in exposure. So if exposure levels are going up or down, we can know about that. And I'm hoping that we'll be able to publish something on that in the future, since the tool has been available for 3 years now. We can, as I've said, we can update the tool with new measurements. So if we made kind of a lookup table that then that would be kind of a static thing, but this way we're always updating it. So if new information comes to light, then the recommendations will change. And also we've really found that it encourages industry engagement. So we get feedback from industry all the time. We get people giving us advice on how we can improve it. We get people volunteering their work sites for sampling, and it's just kind of improved the level of awareness and engagement on silica in the industry. This is I kind of like to think that the silica control tool is a way to to manage relationships between different stakeholders for silica exposure. So we have the silica control tool, and with this platform, it allows us to connect all these different stakeholders. So there are the prime contractors, who are the big construction companies who do have, maybe they do have a hygienist, or they certainly have a lot of health and safety staff, and they're in a position they could be making their own exposure control plans, and they're the ones who are kind of sharing information with us, giving access to work sites, advising us on what needs to improve. And then there are also the small and medium employers, who are the subcontractors, and they don't have as much capacity for generating exposure control plans. But through the silica control tool, it helps the prime contractors and the smaller employers to connect to each other and to both work together towards the same goal. We also can engage with the regulator. The regulator provides feedback on what they need to see in the silica control tool. So that is kind of an indirect way for them to, again, communicate with the prime contractors and the smaller employers. Academia is involved because we're doing research to improve the silica control tools. And so there is that kind of scientific background of it. We could connect with other jurisdictions. There are other jurisdictions that are interested in adopting the silica control tool. And so we've been working with them to try and figure out what they might like to see for something that would be relevant to their jurisdiction. And then also the ideas that they have help us to improve the silica control tool. And also consultants, hygiene consultants, are engaged with the tool as well. We work with them to collect data. They advise us on things that they would like to see to help their clients. They let us know if people are doing silica sampling that might be useful for us. So instead of all these people all working separately on controlling silica, the silica control tool allows us all to work together towards the same goal and share all the same information. I wanted to just let you know some of the updates that we've been doing to the tool. As I mentioned, it launched in the spring of 2017. Since then, we've added over 400 new measurements, mostly from sampling that we've done, but also from literature review, and some people have shared data that they have with us. We've got a version 3 that's going to be launching winter 2020 pretty soon. We've added some new work activities to that. For example, sanding drywall, new control, the sweeping compounds that I mentioned earlier. We've given it a more flexible user interface. So we've done some kind of, so we've actually done a big overhaul of the way that it works. For the user, it should be pretty much the same, but just some of their options that they have now are easier to use. For example, in the past, it was not possible to create an exposure control plan with no engineering controls, which in many cases you might not be using engineering controls, and you would still need to have a plan of how you're going to do it safely. So now that we don't encourage people to do that, but now it is possible. So that's an improvement. And there, as I mentioned, also there are research projects going on associated with the silica control tool. We got some funding from Alberta OHS Futures and did a study in Alberta that we completed in October 2018, and that was looking at the possibility of adopting the tool in Alberta, and we did some measurements in Alberta, and then we've been working with some organizations in Alberta we've been working with some organizations in Alberta to see if that's going to be possible. We're also working in Manitoba to do the same thing, and also to kind of do a refinement of the statistical approach. Okay, this is just an example of what we're kind of thinking about for an improvement of the statistical approach. So right now, the way that it works is we use a linear regression model, and then we present the upper 95th percent confidence limit. So it's a conservative estimate of the mean exposure level that we present right now. But in the future, we think it might be better to use a Bayesian approach and to do a probability-based risk assessment And that might be a more intuitive way for users to interact with this. And this might also allow users to incorporate their own data as a prior. So if you have some of your exposure sampling, you could add that to the Silica control tool and get a more personalized estimate. This is something, it's just an idea. We haven't got it ready yet, and we're working on it in this Manitoba research study. And the example is this expostats.ca website developed by Jerome Lavoué at the University of Montreal, which some of you might be familiar with. And Jerome is working with us on this as well. This is just from his Expostats website. And basically what it does is it shows you the probability of overexposure. And so if your probability of overexposure is less than 5, then you're probably okay. If it's between 5 and 30, then you might need to implement some controls. If it's over 30, then you really need to do something. And so that, we think that might be a more intuitive way for users to work with it. So that's something that we're exploring. And yeah, this is my final slide. So in conclusion, I think this has been a successful approach because it allows data to be used more than once beyond a one-time compliance measurement. We've had really good uptake by industry. You know, we have thousands of users now. And the partnership with the regulator has been successful, and all of their officers are all trained in the use of the tool, and they know what to expect, and they know what an appropriate use of the tool and an inappropriate use would be. And it's just really encouraged exposure measurement and sharing amongst employers in the province. We're doing continual research to support the ongoing development, and we're updating it all the time. And the other takeaway is that it is adaptable to other jurisdictions. I think we haven't rolled it out in any other jurisdictions yet, but we would like to. We think this is a really great approach, and we would love to share it with anybody else who's interested. So that's it for me, and I'm happy to take questions if we have time.
Yes, Melanie, thank you so much. And what a great example. And again, we introduced it last year. Then we actually had a follow-up meetings with Melanie and Hugh Davies and some of our regulators as part of the Occupational Disease Action Plan. And we're hoping to engage some of them going forward as well. What another good example of what we need also is the control banding, but we also need, as Paul pointed out in his presentation earlier, if you go to see, is collecting exposure data and then utilizing that to make decisions so that every small business and industry doesn't have to collect their own data. So Jennifer does have quite a few questions, and Jennifer, do you want to throw them at Melanie?
John asks if you use a confidence interval around your data for a specific process or task.
Yes. So yeah, there's a confidence. So, but when we present a point estimate in the tool, we don't present the confidence interval because we thought that would be too confusing for the users because most of them don't really have much background in statistics. But the number that we present is the 95th confidence, the upper confidence limit around the mean. So it's a conservative exposure estimate.
Great. Martin asks, can the silica exposure data be used retrospectively?
Yes, yeah, it could be used retrospectively. When we did the modeling, we found that time was not a significant variable in our database. And I think this is just because time and use of controls is kind of confounded. So yeah, it could be used to estimate past exposures.
Paul asks, how well do employers cooperate on providing the sampling data for the database? In other words, yeah, if the results are above the OAL, the employer may not be willing to share the data since it would draw unwanted attention.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, yeah, this is always a concern with this kind of work, but we've had pretty good success, you know, because we are an intermediary. We're an industry association for the construction industry. We have good relationships with the industry, and I think that trust has helped us to kind of we tell everybody it's totally anonymous. It's in an anonymized database. We don't share it with anybody. In the Silica control tool, it doesn't show anything about where the data came from. All it shows is just this point estimate of exposure. So we've had good success with that kind of level of trust of knowing that, you know, we're keeping the data completely anonymous. And I think as as we've gone on, it's been 3 years now, or nearly 4 years that this tool has been available, and there have been no issues around this. I think we're just developing more and more trust as time goes on.
Thanks. Melanie, we'll just take one more question, and then we'll introduce John.
Okay.
So the last question, is there an aspect of individual exposure history tracking planned for the site?
Yeah, that's definitely something that we're interested in. Certainly, what we do have in the website is we keep records of all the exposure control plans that people have been generating over time. So we would be seeing, you know, we would keep. Yeah, we have records of everything people have been doing over time. However, the tool, it doesn't really give you your personal exposure level. It gives an estimated exposure level based on what is in our database. So what we would probably be analyzing is more of a population level exposure changes over time. We don't measure individuals' exposure and record that in the website. So we would know what kind of activities people are doing over time and if there is better uptake of control use, but we don't necessarily know what their individual exposure level is because we're not always measuring that.
Thanks, Melanie, so very much, and lots of comments in here. Thanks, Dave, for supporting the Bayesian approach and talking about, you know, and your shout out to Jerome. We tried to throw some links in the chat window as well, Melanie, and appreciate your attendance, and hope everyone shares this presentation with all the powers that be to get this moving in Ontario. So thanks again, and we're going to introduce now John O'Dyke to talk about our regional risk tool for COVID. So John, welcome. He's one of our hygienists, and you're all familiar with John. I don't want to cut him off any further from showing this tool. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Kimberly. The idea behind this tool came from looking at some of the data. For instance, the Public Health Ontario has this map which shows the different regions in Ontario with the different levels of risk or rates of COVID, and they're colored into 5 bands: the blue, green, yellow, orange, and red. However, these are cumulative, and therefore, if something happened in the past, you're forever carrying that around in your data. So what we thought what we needed was some kind of a tool that looks at the current level of activity of COVID in your region, and that we would look at some advice on how to control your risk based on the categories of communicating, cleaning, hand washing, ventilating, distancing, screening, and masking. And we would base it on these categories. So the categories, again, we used the PHO categories and kind of made them, translated them from cumulative to current. And I've compared these to a number of other jurisdictions, and I think they line up quite well. So anything minimal risk is 0 to 0.7 cases in the last 14 days per 10,000 people, and then it's graduated up. Now I know Dave Zalk likes to anytime you make a category, it becomes control banding, but here the categories are defined by actual counts. They're not, there's no subjective aspect of rating it. And here's a graph that we produced that shows the level over time. And what I'm showing here is the Toronto Public Health, so the rate for Toronto, and also the rate for Temiskaming Health Unit. And you can see, contrasting these two areas, that one size does not fit all. And when we started looking at this in the summer, people were still generally looking at one approach to fit all sizes. But really, does it make much sense, since Temiskaming has only had one case since May, which lasted in October for 14 days and then came off, to apply all the controls as compared to Toronto. And so we decided to use this tool, and I'll try to give you an example of our workplace. In our workplace, I live in Brantford, and the workplace is in Hamilton. We also have people who live in Niagara who go to our workplace and who work in the southwestern public health region. And so when you put all those together, you can see we also have somebody who lives in Toronto, and you can see the risk that each person brings to the workplace from each of their regions. And now some of it needs to be taken into context. For instance, if you take the Norfolk, you can see this big jump here in June, and that was an outbreak among migrant farm workers in Huldom and Norfolk. Since then, it's been relatively calm, but you can see how separate incidents, so you need to take this information in context. Now, if you don't like the graphs, we also have a table which tells you what the current region, what level of risk they are in. And then based on that, we have the 7 categories of prevention tips based on the color coding. So I'll look at ventilating, for instance. Anything in the blue, which is a low risk, is something that should be done anyway, whether it's COVID or not. So cleaning the HVAC unit, ensuring proper maintenance and filter changes, keeping the thermostat on instead of auto, so you get a continuous flow of outdoor air. And then once you get into the different categories, for instance, boost washroom ventilation and air changes when the risk in the community gets higher. Keep windows open wherever possible if it doesn't interfere with the HVAC. Review the ventilation checklist. Maintain a relative humidity as high as you can in the winter where feasible, etc., etc. And then when things get really active as far as COVID in your community, then there's things like improved filters, organizing, distancing, etc., and consider UV disinfection, that type of thing. And so masking is another one, which is graded depending on the risk in the community. If the risk in the community is low, wearing a mask is just a symbol. It's a sign of solidarity. Hey, we're all in this together. I'm doing my little piece by keeping my emissions to myself. As the levels increase, it becomes more of etiquette. I'm keeping my emissions to myself in case I'm infected and I don't know about it, and I appreciate you doing it too. As it gets even higher, for instance, my daughter lives in Montreal, and there the rates in the community are extremely high. Also, the practice of wearing masks is very poor, and a lot of people object to it. And so she feels that she needs to wear an N95 when she goes out because distancing is almost impossible. And she lives downtown Montreal near Mount Royal. And so you can see how it graduates the response based on the risk in the. And I want to acknowledge my daughter, Kendra, and my son, Chris, who helped put this together, and Brian Conroy from the Canadian Centre of the Occupational Health and Safety Centre, or the Canadian Centre for Occupational Health and Safety, CCOHS, for helping us out in putting this together. Any questions?
Sure, John. Yeah, if people have questions, we can try to fit one in. before, but really the intent for this one was to show a couple of the tools and get you all to download them and access them and utilize them. And it's really really important, everyone, just as we wait for questions, to complete the evaluations and join us again next week. I think Lawrence has a question.
I see a question from Lawrence about whether the government has embraced this for all risk management.
Thanks.
And no, they haven't. They have their own system. It's different than this one. This one, it has specific suggestions on those 7 categories. So it's a different approach.
And John, I will let you know that Victoria Arundale presented yesterday at OHAO at the Occupational Hygiene Association of Ontario, and she did include a slide in her presentation around COVID and the CSA standard on the regional risk tool, and suggested using it. So that's good news as well. So keep this word spreading, everyone. So. Excellent. Well, I think we will depart for the day, and please join us next week for our final week leading up to November and Lung Month, where Kevin is leading us out on some great speakers, including John and he again on a diesel calculator, talking about the diesel working group, and Sean McGinn and Dr. Christine Oliver will also join us. So thank you everyone for attending, and have a wonderful afternoon. It's almost summer here, so perhaps you can enjoy the last warm day. Take care.